following a decision by the Alabama Supreme Court that ruled frozen embryos are people and deserving of the same rights as children, the political sphere erupted into partisan bickering. Vice President Kamala Harris claimed the court's decision was hypocritical, referring to how the court had also restricted access to abortion and claimed it was part of Republicans' larger assault on reproductive issues. Here's Harris.
Most recently, putting access to IVF at risk. Think about that. Individuals, couples who want to start a family are now being deprived of access to what can help them start a family. So on the one hand, the proponents are saying that an individual doesn't have a right to end an unwanted pregnancy, and on the other hand, the individual does not have a right to start a family. And the hypocrisy abounds on this issue.
Harris also used the opportunity to hit at likely GOP nominee, former President Trump, over his role in the death of Roe v. Wade, saying when you look at the fact that the previous president of the United States was clear in his intention to handpick 3 Supreme Court justices who would overturn the protections of Roe v. Wade, and he did it. And that's what got us to this point today.
Nikki Haley took the opposite track. Haley said, quote, "Embryos to me are babies. When you talk about an embryo, to me, that's a life. And so I do see where that's coming from when they talk about that." Of note, Haley has stipulated that she does not endorse the Alabama decision. She just agrees that an embryo is an unborn baby. The court's decision has caused a ripple effect in the rest of the state, though the court hasn't officially banned IVF. Local news reported that the University of Alabama at Birmingham Health System has paused in vitro fertilization procedures following an Alabama Supreme Court decision due to fear of criminal prosecution and lawsuits. The University of Alabama is the state's major university hospital system. Here now to discuss the decision and IVF more broadly is Emma Waters from the Heritage Foundation. Emma, thank you for joining, and let's start by breaking down a little bit of what the case was actually about, because I think there's some misconceptions here. This case was about a couple that was going through IVF, and their fertilized embryos were being held in storage and were accidentally destroyed by an employee. Now, they actually sued the IVF clinic under the harm to minors statute in Alabama, saying that they should be awarded damages. So can you talk a little bit about the precept for the case and then what the court actually decided?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things with the facts of the case. This was not only one set of parents, but it was actually 3 different sets of parents whose embryos were destroyed. And the part of the case that is particularly notable is it wasn't actually an employee of the fertility clinic. It was actually a patient from the adjoining hospital who wandered into the clinic and found the embryos in an unsecured freezer, which never should have been the case to begin with. When this patient picked up the tray of embryos, the freezer burn was so severe that the patient dropped and shattered all of the embryos, actually killing each one of them. So the 3 sets of parents, when they were alerted that their children that they had entrusted to the fertility clinic had been destroyed because of an outsider who wandered into an unsecure area, they sued the fertility clinic under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, saying that they had entrusted the well-being of their embryonic children to the fertility clinic, but the fertility clinic, due to their own negligence, had actually resulted in the death of their children, and they wanted some sort of legal assistance for that loss that they suffered.
So how would this work if this law were to continue to stay in place in Alabama? It sounds like the largest hospital in Alabama has now stopped all of their IVF practices because they're worried that they'll face criminal charges in the event that they are prosecuted if embryos have the same rights as children, these fertilized eggs that they now have, if they're destroyed because the mother and father don't want to use them, they only want to use a fraction of the eggs that were successfully fertilized. Does that mean now the hospital and the parents are charged, with murder? How do you see this moving forward?
So the Supreme Court case in Alabama only deals with the question of, can frozen embryos be protected under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act? So the court was very careful to say that their ruling only extends to that part of the question. So the ruling basically says that if other embryos were wrongly destroyed, that parents could sue the fertility clinic for negligence or careless behavior if they felt that their children had been destroyed in a way that was somehow the fertility clinic's fault. That's the only extent really that the ruling speaks to. The ruling does go into detail and say that the finer questions that you're asking about embryo destruction broadly, about general practices within the fertility industry, that will have to be answered by the Alabama state legislature going forward to see really what the particulars are of the case and how they want to apply it. With the case of the University of Alabama shutting down their fertility clinic, all this really suggests is that maybe that they themselves are uncertain if they've been treating embryos with the best possible care. So really, this is a win for parents and the children involved who have entrusted these fertility clinics with their children, investing a lot of time and money and emotional difficulty in this process. And it seems that like the baseline expectation that parents should have is that fertility clinics will treat these embryos with the absolute care. So if clinics are starting to shut down or cease practicing for the time being, it means that they're reassessing their standards to make sure that they're actually doing the thing they're telling parents that they'll do, namely protecting their children.
I saw some consternation from critics of this decision as well, Emma, in accordance with one of the justices' language that he used. He determined, in his opinion, that it is rights from the Creator, particularly the right to life, that extends to an embryo, and people were accusing him of violating separation from church and state. He pointed out that the Alabama Constitution specifically uses the term sanctity of life when describing the right to life that's given to all human beings in that state. What is your take on that particular part of the ruling and his decision to invoke a sort of religious framework in terms of determining the rights of embryos?
Of course. So this was in the concurring opinion by Chief Justice Parker, where he did a deep dive into the state constitution's understanding of the sanctity of human life. So it's really important to note here that his opinion, that none of the opinion actually added to or changed how Alabamians had been thinking about the sanctity of human life. They only extended that application from children who were born. It's already been extended to children who were in the womb, and now they've extended it to embryonic children. And so he goes through the detailed history of how Alabamians had understood sanctity of human life. And this included everyone's from theologians, quotes from scripture, as well as just natural law teaching. And the thing I think that stands out the most in his opinion is that he recognized that each human life has an incalculable value and worth that goes far beyond our ability to describe it and even our ability to quantify it in some form or fashion. And that within each one of us, there's this deeper truth that says, no, there is something about the unborn child, regardless of what state they are in their development, that is worthy of our protection. Because, right, like if this embryo is implanted in a woman and continues to grow naturally, it will result in a live baby. Many people are the result of IVF, right? And they began in this embryonic state outside of the womb. And so he simply said that the sanctity of human life, like we've always understood it, that children have this inherent worth and dignity, should be applied to humans at all stages of development, not just those who are walking and talking around today.
I'm very curious about this Chief Justice Tom Parker, responsible for the decision in the Alabama courts. It seems to me that, his theocratic beliefs run pretty deep. Now, he indicated on a show he went on with a man by the name of Mr. Enloe, who's a well-known, QAnon conspiracy theorist, also believes in a theocratic vision for the United States, one where we have a Christian nationalist state. Now, Justice Parker on the podcast said that he supports the, quote, Seven Mountains Mandate, which is a vision for a Christian nationalist state. Parker also told Enloe on the podcast that God is equipping him with something for the very specific situation that he's facing. The judge also, or justice rather, also said that Trump is on assignment from God to work with the angels Michael and Gabriel to take down George Soros and Bill Gates. And he believes God created government and that it's heartbreaking we've let it go into the possession of others. Now, it's concerning to me, someone who's not a Christian but living in the United States, subject to the justice system that we have, that there are judges that believe they serve God rather than the Constitution and laws that we have. Is this something that concerns either of you?
So this is a really interesting point that obviously a lot of people have highlighted having concerns with here, this quote unquote theocratic vision that's being put forward. And I think what's really important to break down here, that the justice in this framing is not violating this separation of church and state that that Jefferson referenced, not even in a constitutional document, right, but like in a letter separately. That what he's doing here is he's showing how his personally held beliefs shape his worldview. And this is something that no one, regardless of what your religious affiliation is exempt from. We all bring our own personal worldview, our own way of seeing the world, our own beliefs about the nature of man, of woman, of the afterlife, if there is a divine, if there's not a divine being, to bear on our the way that we address any issue, right? Like my worldview, particularly as a Christian, his worldview as a Christian, and yours from a different perspective are no less religious in the sense that we all worship something, we all view something as our highest good. And then it's a question of how that worldview shapes the way that we think about these really important issues. And so this idea that there's some sort of like myth of moral neutrality or religious neutrality just simply isn't the case in how any law has been built out, but certainly not in Western civilization. And frankly, let's look at the things he's advocating for. He says that he wants to protect unborn life so that parents who deeply desire the opportunity to bear children don't have their children destroyed through the carelessness of a fertility clinic. He's saying that he wants to ensure that children have the opportunity to be born, to experience life. And when adults or a financially motivated fertility industry wrongs them in some way, that he wants to hold them accountable. I don't think that this is any sort of religious extremism as much as it is just common sense barriers on how we practice the creation of human life and how we protect children at all stages of development.
Yeah,
I just
would
want to
agree.
be really clear, just a quick follow-up. If someone were to say that they believed in the Nation of Islam and they feel very upset that the US government has fallen in the hands of someone other than Allah and that their guiding principles as a Muslim were the rules of Islam and that they wanted a caliphate in the United States, what would you be okay with that as well, based on your opinions of religious freedom and the separation of church and state?
Well, if I remember correctly, Representative Omar already effectively said that when she said that Somalia was her highest good, not the United States. And last time I checked, no one has tried kicking her out of office for saying something that clearly is very problematic because the well-being of the United States is not her number one objective. And so I think we already have examples of this all across the board that have been pushed back on rightly by many conservatives. But ultimately, what we're dealing with here is not someone saying, here's a Christian regime that we're going to lay down. Here's a Muslim regime. Here's an atheistic regime that we're laying down here. The real questions come down to specific pieces of legislation. And if we think about even how the founding of our system has been set up, we are factions warring against other factions, which meant that our founders intended different religious beliefs, different moral beliefs, different convictions to come to play here in the public square of policymaking so that we would have the opportunity to bring our different worldviews to bear and to work on policies that we think align with our vision of the good. So this is actually a very normal process here in America. This is a very normal process for how our system was set up for people to say like, hey, based on my deeply held beliefs, this is what I think is good for humans. And another person to say, based on my deeply held beliefs, here's what I think. And then we battle it out in policy and public discussions and messaging, and hopefully come to a solution that one, the majority of the American people agree with, but two, that actually protects unborn life and reflects this vision of the good, because we do all have the responsibility to be true to these deeply held beliefs that we have. And frankly, at the end of the day, if it comes down to which regime I want to live in, I would much rather live in a regime where I knew that my embryonic children were not going to be destroyed by a fertility clinic, or that my unborn child would be protected from financially motivated actors, or that my child who is born with special needs would not receive special different treatment throughout her life, than a regime that has no care for the unborn human life.
Yeah, it's important that we quickly note for our viewers that translation of Ilhan Omar's statements were disputed by Ilhan Omar and then fact-checked by people who speak the language, and that is not what she said.
I would just push back a little bit and say, at the very least, since Ilhan Omar and other practicing Muslims have taken office, no one has asked them to check their beliefs at the door when they go into Congress. And I think it's a misunderstanding of Thomas Jefferson's clause about separation of church and state, which was written in that letter to the Danbury Baptist, to think that anyone has to reject their own moral framework when they decide to legislate. And for some reason in this country, we've got it in our minds that Christians and only Christians are the ones required to ignore ignore every part of their moral framework that comes from a religious instruction when they enter government, and yet no one else is asked to do the same thing. I don't think a Christian moral framework is any less valid when deciding what's best for the country than any other type of moral framework, whether it's atheistic, agnostic, Islamic, Jewish, etc. And if we go back and look at that letter to the Danbury Baptists as well, we see that Thomas Jefferson was not so much concerned about religion impacting government, but about government infringing on religion. And I think we're out of time, but Jess, I want to give you the opportunity to have a quick response before we close it out.
No, I think we're good to close it out. Thanks, Amber.
You bet. More Rising after this.